Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Veterans for Peace No Nukes webinar. My name is Jerry Condon. I serve on the Board of Directors of Veterans for Peace and the coordinating committee of our Nuclear Abolition Working Group, which is the sponsor of today's webinar. We are honored to have Ann Wright as our moderator today. Ann Wright is a former Army colonel and State Department official who served in U.S. embassies around the world. Ann publicly resigned from the State Department in 2003, courageously stating her opposition to the illegal U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. Since then, Ann has emerged as a highly respected leader in the peace movement, nationally and internationally. Ann is often found with Code Pink speaking truth to power in the halls of Congress. She is a leading member of Women Cross the DMZ, that's the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. She has been an indispensable leader of the Women's Boats to Gaza and the Gaza Freedom Flotilla. She serves on the Advisory Board of Veterans for Peace, where she is also a key member of the VFP Golden Rule Committee, which coordinates the voyages of the historic Golden Rule anti-nuclear sailboat. Ann has been in New York City this week, participating in some of the events surrounding the meeting of the many nations who have signed and ratified the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Thank you for your service, Ann, and welcome.
Well, thank you, Jerry, and thank you to the Vets for Peace Coalition, the advocacy group for the abolition of nuclear weapons. And it's been a real pleasure to be invited to be the moderator. We have two great speakers for us. Before we get to them, I'll give a quick little summary of the remarkable events that are going on right now at the United Nations, and this is a part of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which of course the United States has not signed, and reminding us that the United States tested over 1,000 atomic weapons, nuclear weapons, costing more than $100 billion at that point. And now we have a program that the United States has embarked on to how to call it, advance them, get better yield out of the nuclear weapons we still have at a cost of over $1 trillion over the next 30 years. And of course, we all know that should one country use a nuclear weapon, the next country is going to use it, and we're all in trouble. We're all in trouble. I'll mention a couple of things that did have happened here in New York City. We've had a lot of people who are the victims of nuclear weapons and atomic weapons, and it's their testimony that I hope that we will use in our communities, in our states, to get a movement going so that our Congress, every president will say we just can't use these nukes. You know, right now it's China that has no first use policy. That's the only one of the nuclear countries that has that. We, the United States, don't have it now. But you talk to people from Japan. Many of you have heard the Habakasha, who have spoken about the terrors of the atomic bombs in 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and all the horrific things that those people had to go through. There were other people that were there. In fact, the voices of Korean atomic bomb victims were highlighted at this session, because there's going to be a tribunal next year, and Veterans for Peace is going to be a part of it, where the victims, the Korean victims of the horrible 1945 atomic bombs, are going to be having their testimonies. We had testimonies from the Marshall Islands, from Kazakhstan, from Kiribati, from French Polynesia, downwinders in the United States, Native Americans, people who worked in uranium mines that sent the uranium apparently to the United States, and it was used in the very beginning. And some of it came from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and those people are suffering from the radiation for that. So there was a lot that has been going on. Not only I, as a member of Veterans for Peace, but Ellen Barfield was there, Anthony Donovan, Elliot Adams, and then Brad Wolf, who's one of our associate members, who is working hard on this tribunal, as he did for the tribunal on the merchants of death of the weapons manufacturers. So anyway, there's a lot going on here, and we will be letting you know more about it over the time through the Veterans Group on Abolition of Nuclear Weapons. So that's the update from New York. Now, we are thrilled to have with us two speakers today, Norman Soloman and KJ Noh. I will introduce Norman first. He's going to speak about 25 minutes, and then when he finishes, then we'll introduce KJ. But Norman Soloman is a journalist, a media person, an activist. He's the national director of Roots Action. Many of the petitions you've signed come from Roots Action. He's the executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. And man, do we need that now? He co-wrote with Daniel Ellsberg in 2021 the article "To Avoid Armageddon, Don't Modernize Missiles, Eliminate Them." He's written many books, including War Made Invisible, How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine, War Made Easy, How Presidents and Pundits Keep Spinning Us to Death, and many, many other books. And Norman, as a good friend from Veterans for Peace, we really thank you for being with us today. Please go ahead.
Hey, thanks a lot, Ann, and appreciation for everybody and to everybody who is joining us here. I know that there are a whole lot of activists from around the United States and beyond who are with us at this moment. This moment we know that's part of a era of just huge peril. It's really beyond words, and yet here we are. We don't get to choose our time in history, and we're, so to speak, stuck with it. But we can, of course, make huge changes and huge difference. I want to really start with a note of appreciation to Veterans for Peace. I think there's no more important organization for peace and justice, not only for the United States, but for the entire world. Dan Ellsberg often spoke with tremendous warmth, privately and publicly, about Veterans for Peace. He was a very enthusiastic about being an active member. And I know with us this evening, we have representatives of the Daniel Ellsberg chapter in Seattle of Veterans for Peace. I don't think I've ever read a more important book than Dan Ellsberg's The Doomsday Machine. And when I read it and reread it, I think routinely about how Dan emphasized, and he used this word, the insanity of nuclear weapons. And that brings to mind often a statement, and I often quote it, from Martin Luther King Jr. He talked about what he called the madness of militarism, and he connected it to the social ills, the injustices that were prevalent when he spoke in 1967, and certainly are prevalent with us in 2025, what Dr. King called the demonic destructive suction tube that takes such enormous resources and funds and energies and human creativity and pulls it into the military and war enterprises when the crying need is there for healthcare, education, housing, so many other aspects of sustaining life that are absent and so deficient in our own society, not to mention, and we should mention, elsewhere in the world. In Dan's book, The Doomsday Machine, he really repeatedly came back to and emphasized the question of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, we, of course, want to shut down all of the nuclear triad. At the same time, Dan emphasized that it is the land-based part of the triad that is the most dangerous of these dangerous weapons. And it is a huge battle to get attention about that reality in the US news media and in the politics of this country. And I want to talk a little bit about that. The 400 different nuclear weapons that are land-based in 5 different states in underground silos on hair trigger alert are weapons that it's not good enough for the military-industrial complex to have them there. No, they need to have another haul of weapons and huge profits to Northrop Grumman and other contractors, huge cost overruns, part of the well over $1 trillion so-called euphemistically called modernization of nuclear weapons that Ann referred to. And so tremendous lobbying and real barriers that we need to get through about these new, geared up, modernized, quote unquote, nuclear weapons that are planned called Sentinel. And of course, there are all these names that are cosmetics on the death machine, the face of the death machine. And I think of how 40 and more years ago, there was a plan to put nuclear weapons in Western states at one point on racetracks, on trains. And when the MX missile was being promoted during the Reagan administration, at a certain point, as I recall, the Spinmeisters decided to change the name to Peacekeeper or Peacemaker or whatever. And they're constantly trying to use euphemisms and PR language to distract from the fact that these are death machines of unprecedented proportions. The best estimates are really with nuclear winter that 98 to 99% of humanity would be destroyed with not so much the initial terrible destruction, but the ongoing then destruction of agriculture on the planet because of nuclear winter. And the evasion that we get through the attitudes, the silences, the euphemisms of politicians and US mass media, these amount to sometimes very loud and verbose, but they amount to silences about the reality of the doomsday machines and what's at stake. And as is so often the case for us in so many realms of political activism, we have the challenge, the responsibility to break the silence, to shatter the pretenses that are enforced with all sorts of evasive language and political power plays, and yes, just keeping quiet. And we, I think, can remember in the 1980s, the activism from ACT UP, where with the deadly avoidance and connivance of the US government, many were dying from AIDS unnecessarily and preventably. And so the slogan was silence equals death. And so that's certainly true in terms of the entire fate of humanity that dangles by a thread, weighed down by nuclear weapons. I want to say that we sometimes can fall into media traps when we talk about nuclear weapons. And sometimes it involves making points that are necessary but insufficient. And I want to specifically refer to the cost of nuclear weapons. It's very true that they are obscenely expensive, that they come at the cost of, even as the, I wouldn't say peace activist Dwight Eisenhower, came at the cost of children's lives, of every bomb, every bullet, every tank, as he said, is a theft from the children of the world. That's all very true. In addition to that, it does appear, based on the history of the nuclear age, that people generally, with some exceptions, but overall, people tend to be very willing to pay any amount of money for some weapon system if they believe it's making them safer. And so when we make the case, as we should, that the nuclear weapons expenditures are just absurdly and damagingly high, the fact remains that we also have the task to convey to policymakers, and most importantly, to build movements that convey and insist to policymakers that these nuclear weapons, far from making us as human beings more safe, make us less safe. That's a point that Dan Ellsberg really emphasized when he spoke in his last years and in his book, The Doomsday Machine, because when you have these ICBMs that are land-based, they're vulnerable. They can be taken out by a first strike from another nuclear power. And as a result, they're on launch on warning. There's no other weapon system, sea-based, air-based, where that's the case. Dan made the point that it's only the ICBMs that would require a president to decide literally in a matter of minutes. There's estimates 10, 15, 20 minutes to decide whether it's an authentic attack, which to them, to that president, would require launching missiles at Russia and China and so forth. Is it a real attack? Is it a flock of geese? Did somebody put a test cartridge recording into the wrong slot at the wrong time? That's why ICBMs should be shut down. And there are many groups that have called for that. We've had the campaign at rootsaction.org for a couple of years now to demand the shutdown of all ICBMs. And in point of fact, we've had a process of trying to inform every member of Congress. We hand-delivered 535 copies of Dan's book for every congressional office in DC several years ago. Part of, I think, our obstacle or dilemma in talking about the expense has been very well illustrated in the last couple of years, where a lot of groups banded together and quite properly decided they were going to give a priority to stopping the new generation, so to speak, the death generation of ICBMs called Sentinel. We knew they were going to be very expensive. So peace and disarmament groups said, well, we're going to launch a campaign called Money Pit. These Sentinel weapons are a money pit, and those nuclear weapons should not be designed, manufactured, and deployed because they are simply a waste of money. And that sounded good until the chair of, at the time, the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith, made a pronouncement that actually he thought it would be cheaper to build the Sentinel ICBMs than to simply refurbish the existing Minuteman III missiles. So there we were, peace groups caught flat-footed by just this argument coming from this particular militarist in power in Washington, which was echoed elsewhere. Of course, the cost overruns now with the Sentinel. It's all arguable what is cheaper. That's really not our debate. Our debate is that it's insane, dangerous, and a threat to humanity to have a single ICBM, and that they all should be shut down as a process to continue to struggle to shut down all nuclear weapons, every single one of them. You may remember that a few months ago, and actually a couple of years ago as well, there have been some very good articles featured in the New York Times, really high production values, moving video and animated graphics, and articles, among other things, about the ICBMs and where they are in these various states. And going back to the MX plans, it was in part opposition from people who lived in Nevada, Utah, and elsewhere in the West that eventually blocked the MX plan, along with many activists around the country. And when I wrote to one of the people who put this together at the New York Times, and I said, I think this is really good reporting, but why don't you read Dan Ellsberg's book? And then also report on why these weapons are extraordinarily dangerous for the future of humanity on the planet. And there was no reply. I hadn't met this person, but there was no reply at all, because it is very difficult for us to hammer this message that we've got to find more ways, more effective ways to hammer. It's not as though officials have not made the point. William, the former defense secretary, under I'm spacing the name, Obama. Under Obama, the former defense secretary made the point that these are dangerous weapons. They should be shut down. There's a New York Times op-ed to that effect many years ago. And it's not like it's a secret that these are the most dangerous weapons. And yet it's not enough to mention it once or twice, get it into the news media once or twice. We need to build campaigns around this, and it means navigating the media and the politics of the country more effectively. And we know that organizing is always going to be the way to do that. And so all kinds of media avenues, I think, are really essential. We've all, I think, felt frustrations about dealing with mainstream media. We can get through the cracks in the wall sometimes, but it's often frustrating. And I use the analogy that the mass media are our wall, but the wall has cracks in it. And we need to find ways to find those cracks and enlarge them and get through them with our messaging, not only to reach the broad public, but as a means for our more effective organizing and building, hopefully, a very mass movement. Maybe we can get into some of the details about media activism and so forth during the Q&A. I do want to mention that many of us a year ago were very encouraged by the Oppenheimer film, and a lot of groups used it to good advantage to try to reach a broader audience. And I think it was, a good thing that the film happened. And it reached a lot of people. It is a pause for reflection, though, that a year later, that film and its impacts seem to have largely dissipated. And I think that tells us something about the limitations of show business, of the entertainment industry in the context of US media. Before I close, I want to say a little bit about Ukraine and about Gaza. One of the realities is that the Ukraine war has greatly increased the chances of a nuclear war. And it's very notable that just days after the, I think, reprehensible, terrible invasion of Ukraine by Russia, President Biden gave a State of the Union address. And I think it was about 6,000 words. And not one of them was about nuclear war, nuclear weapons, or the increased risk of a nuclear conflict because of the face-off basically between NATO and Russia. And we have to change that dynamic. We've got to insist that the Cold War has to be reversed, that the refusal to talk with Russia has to change, that the refusal to acknowledge that Russia has its own security concerns, we may or may not agree with them, just as Russians may or may not agree with Washington's security concerns. But diplomacy is essential, and war is happening now. That's got to be stopped in Ukraine. It's clearly horrific. And a lot of folks who have been working for disarmament have been unwilling or unable to, I think, challenge the anti-Russia propaganda that has really brought us closer to nuclear conflagration. So I do want to emphasize that we can't, on the one hand, we can't, at least logically, I think, say that we are struggling for peace and disarmament and to eliminate the risk of nuclear war, and on the other hand, say that diplomacy is wrong for Ukraine, that somehow diplomacy with Russia shouldn't happen. And it's not far-fetched to say that some of our best advocates for peace, like former Congresswoman Barbara Lee when she was in office, she's done wonderful work, but she denounced the very concept of an American president meeting and talking with Vladimir Putin. These leaders need to talk to each other, and we need to insist that these leaders talk to each other. One other point before I close, and that is that the only nuclear power in the Middle East is Israel. And depending on estimates, it has 80, 100, 200 nuclear weapons. Dan Ellsberg befriended the great Israeli whistleblower Mordecai Vanunu, who spent many, many years in solitary. He was close to 20 years in prison for having the audacity to reveal that Israel had not only a nuclear weapons program, but a lot of nuclear weapons. And as we look at the slaughter, the genocide that the US has supported in Gaza, at the same time, I think we need to call out the fact that not only is the US government a direct participant in the genocide, but that the US government won't even acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons, even while there is an ongoing threat of Israeli and/or US attacks on Israel because of its reported nuclear program. So I'd sort of close, whether it's about human rights or peace or anything else, the way to go is to have a single standard of human rights, a single standard of proper conduct between countries. There's a saying among blues artists that you might feel you're getting lost, but you won't if you know the blues. And I think for activists, as we navigate the terrain of ideologies and nationalism and different political tendencies, it sometimes can seem like we will or might be getting lost. But I think if we retain a single standard for human rights and for peace, we won't get lost and we can build an effective movement.
Well, thank you very much, Norman. We really appreciate that. You covered a lot of territory, and I'm sure that we are having lots of good things in the chat. I mean, one thing you got to say about old Trump, he's talking, he's starting to talk to people, and as you mentioned, it's talking that can resolve things and not the bombs that we continue to make. And we may all have a dispute with him on his increase in the military budget, and that's something we've got to work on. I do have my Veterans Against Genocide shirt on that we do have for sale from Veterans for Peace, and thank you for raising the issues of Ukraine, for the issues of Israel and Gaza, and the issues of how we respond to media. So there's a lot in there. We really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. And our next speaker is KJ Noh. You've seen him on many webinars also. He's a journalist, a political analyst, educator. Global politics, geopolitics, and the political economy are the things that he's speaks about a lot. And for the region of Asia and the Pacific, he's a member of Veterans for Peace. He's a co-founder of Pivot to Peace and the co-host of the China Report that's on Breakthrough News Network. So KJ, we welcome you, and please go right ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you. I'm going to share my slides. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So this is really probably one of the most important presentations that we are doing because the stakes are so high. And we really want to talk about how US militarism could lead to nuclear war. I just want to give you some breaking news right now. This just happened earlier today or yesterday. South Korea bombed its own citizens during a military exercise. Let me just show you a clip.
한미 연합훈련에 참가한 우리군 전투기에서 투하된 폭탄이 한낮에 마을을 덮치는 초유의 사고가 났습니다. 15명이 다치고 건물 여러 채가 파손됐습니다. 먼저
15
정한솔
people
기자가
were injured,
보도합니다.
and 6 houses were demolished.
화물차 한 대가 마을로 들어서는 순간 큰 폭발과 함께 화염이 치솟습니다. 건물 잔해와 나뭇가지가 날리고 곧이어 희뿌연 연기가 주변을 집어삼킵니다.
그게 아니고 우리 집이 다 날라갔어. 몰라. 뭐가 터졌어.
오늘 오전 경기도 포천시 이동면 노곡리에 갑자기 폭탄 8발이 잇따라 떨어졌습니다. 한미연합훈련에 참가한 우리군 전투기에서 투하한 폭탄이었습니다.
This was the
10시
US
4분경
Republic of
공군
Korea military
KF-16에서
exercise.
MK-82
They
일반 폭탄
dropped
8발이 비정상 투하되어 사격장 외부
bombs.
지역에
These are
낙탄되었습니다.
500-pound bombs.
멀리 떨어진 도로에서도 연기 구름이 목격될 정도로 충격이 컸습니다. 폭탄을 맞은 마을은 폐허가 됐습니다. 건물 지붕이 내려앉았고 주택 뒤쪽은 아예 움푹 패였.
Okay, so I think you get the message. I mean, this has been a very, very awful bombing, and it's something that we could have expected because South Korea is doing just so many military exercises. It's just kind of nonstop. Last year, they did 250 days of military exercises. And then this year, they're planning to do 275 days. As the person was saying in Korean, which I didn't translate, the low-flying F-16s dropped 8 500-pound MK-82 bombs on a village in South Korea. And they were supposed to drop them on a target range, but they were 8 kilometers off. They injured 15 people. And this village is within walking distance of the North Korean border. So you can imagine how the North Koreans are currently responding to this. So there's a constant escalation of war games on the Korean peninsula. I remind people F-16s can carry nuclear weapons. Even though they had this catastrophic bombing of Koreans inside South Korea, they have war games that are scheduled starting on March 10th. These are massive war games, and they said these war games will continue as scheduled. So where does this lead to? And what's going on in Korea? What's going on in the peninsula? And one of the things for us to understand this is to understand that South Korea very recently declared martial law. It was, again, a night of terror. I'm going to show you another video.
북한 공산 세력의 위협으로부터 자유 대한민국을 수호하고 우리 국민의 자유와 행복을 약탈하고 있는 파렴치한 종북 반국가 세력들을 일거에 척결하고 자유 헌정 질서를 지키기 위해 비상계엄을 선포합니다.
I'm going to jump and I'm going to show you.
제를 요구하면 비상계엄령을 해제해야 합니다.
Some people, and then we can see here that martial law troops have been sent. These are special warfare. But luckily, the National Assembly members, they're enough
파도처럼 밀려오는 상황에서 일단은 막아야겠다라는 생각으로 몸으로 막다가 이제 저도 쓰러지고 쓰러지는 과정에서 이제 뭐 안경 날라가고 핸드폰 뭐 모든 뭐 가방도 끊어질 뻔했고.
So anyway, South Korea dodged a bullet. Certainly, it was a very, very frightening night for Koreans. They were very, very worried. Because when you say martial law in the Korean language, or when you say martial law to Koreans, it is really probably the most frightening word you can say in the Korean language. It reminds people of disappearances, arbitrary arrests, death camps, concentration camps, massive, unbridled violence. So this was really a night of terror. And this really was a night of terror. I won't show you more, but you know, there are scenes where people are throwing their bodies and trying to block armored cars from going through. This is a brief timeline. The key thing is that Yoon, when he declared this, he said that the opposition party was conducting anti-state activities, collaborating with North Korean communists, and that they had created a legislative dictatorship. He banned all political activities, including the National Assembly. He banned all gatherings, he suspended the press, and he planned the arrest of all of his opponents. The units that were sent were the 707 Special Forces Mission Group. This is very important, and I'll explain that in a moment. But at the same time, several weeks before that and months before that, South Korea had planned drone incursions into North Korea. These were very, very provocative. Military drones were shot down in North Korean territory. All of this, it undermines the assertion that South Korea is some kind of mature leading democracy. In fact, if thousands of Koreans had not streamed out at midnight and run interference against the martial law troops, South Korea's democracy would have ended right then and there. But we're not out of the woods yet. You have to remember that Yoon was touted as the leader of a global pivot state that was championing liberal democracy around the world. When Yoon declared martial law, none of the Western powers, certainly not the United States, condemned what he did. The only thing they said is, we are watching things closely, and our relationship with South Korea is ironclad. In fact, Vedant Patel was asked if he condemned martial law. He refused. And then he was asked if he supported the rescission of martial law. And again, he couldn't say anything. I can't get ahead of myself. Jake Sullivan was asked, were you surprised at the martial law declaration? He said, I was surprised at the declaration and its rescission, which is not the question he was asked. And the Taiwan DPP authorities were actually very, very supportive of this. They said that South Korean legislature has been controlled by pro-North Korean forces, and that they lauded this declaration of martial law. And they said they were undergoing the same situation. Yoon also had plans to kidnap opposition party members, possibly torture them, and very likely kill them as a false flag attack. How do we know this? Because there were North Korean uniforms the South Korean military had commissioned. They had commissioned 170 North Korean military uniforms, and a media person, Kim Ho-jun, said that he had been told that the plan was to kill off South Korean opposition leaders and then to blame it on North Korea and to discover the uniforms, which the South Korean military had actually ordered. There were also plans, or there were actually 300 shells that were fired in June, September, and November into the northern limit line, which is a disputed territory. So this is extraordinarily provocative. We know that this was very, very long-term preparations. Probably at least as early as April of last year, they had prepared martial law. There are factors which led to its failure, but Yoon was receiving constant stroking from the US and the West, even as he was persecuting, prosecuting, smashing every democratic and civil institution in the Republic of Korea. And he was, they called him Washington's perfect partner. So constantly the US was lauding him. Anthony Blinken said it was one of the strongest, most dynamic democracies in the world. And all of this begs the question, what did the US know and when did it know it? How much did it know? Pentagon refuses to comment, but we know that all previous coups in South Korea have been green-lighted by the US. And the US has de facto control over all troops in South Korea, which is to say, the Korean military reports to the CFC-UNC command, which is a joint command led by the USFK general, a 4-star. And the US has wartime OPCON over South Korean troops. So anyway, simply from the idea of avoiding friendly fire incidents, you have to notify the US military, because if you don't, you're going to end up with a friendly fire incident. Just as you can see with the military war games, you know, they just bombed a Korean village. But any kind of military movement requires coordination with the US. Otherwise, you're going to end up with counter battery fire and friendly fire incidents. And the Special Warfare Forces, the ROK Special Warfare Forces, and the US Special Warfare Forces are the most tightly integrated special warfare forces in the world. They literally function, or they're designed to function as a single institution. So when you have hundreds of South Korean Special Warfare Forces going to the National Assembly, you can be quite sure that the US was aware of this. And the US has a panopticon over South Korea. Everything that happens on the Korean Peninsula, the US knows about. So why did they do this? We can think about the reason why. Essentially, the plan was to trigger a war with North Korea and blame North Korea, and then use that as the pretext to declare martial law. And if there is war with North Korea, as a matter of agreement, the US takes control over South Korean troops, over all of South Korea's 500,000 troops, plus potentially another 3.1 million reserve troops. So this would have been an incredible force projection platform for the United States. We are very sure that there was foreknowledge, and there is a very interesting article written about a year ago in 38 North, and they say that North Korea was going to attack South Korea. And there's absolutely no logic to this article. They say they're going to attack because Kim Jong-un was miffed and that they had found that diplomacy didn't work, and therefore they had run out of options. Now, that is a complete and total absurdity, because between breaking off diplomatic relations and starting a full-scale war, there's a lot of things that you can do in between that, including simply continuing to disengage. But Carlin and Hecke, who are the consummate insiders, Washington insiders on Korea, said that North Korea was going to attack. And when they say that North Korea has no good options left, there's something missing in the syllogism. The enthymeme is missing a premise. And essentially that premise is probably that the US was planning to trigger a war with North Korea. This is the article. Kim Jong-un has made a strategic decision to go to war. And then they said that they would do a surprise attack. And this echoes exactly what Yoon himself had been planning when he was preparing his martial law. And of course, I just want to point out the absurdity. North Korea's military budget is about $1.7 billion. That's about 1/3 of the Taylor Swift era's concert tour's takings, or if you will, about 1/4 or 1/5 of the NYPD. So the notion that North Korea with tiny military budget would, out of the blue, start a war with the United States and South Korea is absurd on its face. But it would have been a solution because the US would get OPCON over South Korean troops. Korea would be under martial law. Those troops could be sent to Ukraine, or they could be used on the Korean Peninsula to escalate against both Russia and China. And there is a historical pattern to this. The US has always deployed South Korean troops to clean up losing US wars. For example, during the Vietnam War, South Korea sent 340,000 troops to Vietnam, and they were a larger presence than US forces after 1972. So this explains all these kind of canards about North Korean troops in Ukraine. Probably the plan was to send South Korean troops to Ukraine under the pretext that North Korean troops are already there. Of course, it doesn't make any sense because North Korea has no interoperability with Russian troops. This is not Stone Age warfare where you just throw bodies into the battlefield. Without interoperability in an incredibly complex environment which requires instantaneous communication and coordination, sending in troops that don't speak the language and are not interoperable is just an act of madness. So it just doesn't make any sense. But if you think that South Korea is planning to send troops and that the US was planning to take control over South Korea's troops, then this canard starts to make sense. As I said, the US had to have known what was going to happen, and it certainly would have benefited. As I said, it would have gotten operational control over all of South Korea's troops that are NATO interoperable, trained for attritional and cold weather warfare, trench warfare, and combined arms warfare. And Yoon is continuing to incite people even as he's facing impeachment. The impeachment process in the Constitutional Court has just ended, but he's continuing to incite his followers. And if you look at his followers, they are all waving American flags. Now, war in Korea could go nuclear. In fact, there's probably a very, very good chance that it is planning, that the plans are to go nuclear. And you have to understand that war in Korea is simply a pretext or a stalking horse for war against China. So there is a very, very real risk of nuclear war in the current moment. I just want to show you one more video because I think it's really, really important. And this is about the history or the ethics of nuclear war. This is Mike Wallace in 1958 spoke to Reinhold Niebuhr, who is considered to be one of the most important theologians of the 20th century. And he's often referred to as the ethical architect of US foreign policy. So let me just show you that.
For this reason, that I will accept every interpretation of Christianity that is derived from the Bible, as many people wouldn't accept my interpretation, but that's what it means for me. And this is why I think there is an ultimate answer in a true religious faith, but it doesn't give you any immediate answers. It doesn't, you know, one of the young physicists at the Institute asked me, he said, I know that there's a general religious frame which I accept. I wouldn't say that they all, but he said he accepts. But does it give you a particular answer? And I said, no, it doesn't give us a particular answer. You can't say that religion or irreligion will give us a particular answer to the nuclear dilemma. I think I have one answer that is partly religious and partly secular. And that is to say, we ought to at least recognize that we and the Russians are in a common predicament. That would be a religious in the sense, judge not that if you be not judged. We judge the Russians because they're living in a despotism and we don't like it. But we've gotten into a fix now where we're living in a common predicament. We ought to recognize this common predicament. That doesn't mean that the summit conference ought to be held or succeed, but we ought to really at least recognize the common predicament of communists and Democrats or Americans, whatever.
Let me ask you this. I think it was Bertrand Russell who fairly recently said, and other people have said it along with him, that if it came to communism or nuclear war, communism or possible incineration, they'd choose to live under communism. How do you feel about that?
Well, about Bertrand Russell, I know that he's a great philosopher or logical mathematician, but I think my friend Sidney Hook is right about it, and that all the achievements in this field are no substitute for common sense. And what Bertrand Russell is saying is that capitulation to communism is better than a nuclear war, but that isn't the point. We have to risk a nuclear war in order to escape capitulation to communism. For all I know, we may stumble into this terrible war, but no nation can say we will capitulate to tyranny rather than accept a speculative fate, to accept an absolute fate in alternative to speculative.
So I don't know if you were able to hear that clearly, but essentially what Reinhold Niebuhr is saying, and remember, Reinhold Niebuhr is considered to be the most important theologian of the 20th century. He was, one of the key inspirations for example, people like Martin Luther King and Chris Hedges. They refer to him constantly. But the point that I'm making here is that Reinhold Niebuhr is saying that he would rather see a nuclear war than to coexist under a communist system. And I think that is a very, very frightening thing to hear. Essentially what he's saying here is Wallace asked Niebuhr, communism or nuclear war? And Niebuhr's response is, essentially his response is that nuclear war is preferable to communism. In other words, we would rather see the end of the planet than the end of the capitalist system that he was a proponent of. In other words, we have to risk a nuclear war in order to prevent capitulation to communism. In other words, to use the parlance of that period, better dead than red. And so we can understand this as a kind of apocalyptic Christianity or apocalyptic Lutheranism. In the end, it boils down not as a matter of ethics, but really a kind of religious creed masquerading as rational, ethical, national policy. And Niebuhr has influenced generations of national policy thinkers like Kennan and Morgenthau and Hamre and etc. So another example is John Hamre, who is the head of CSIS deep state think tank. And again, he refers to Reinhold Niebuhr. And he says that, we have to wage war against evil, against an evil man, Putin. We see it in China, they're genociding, and we have to wage this great war against the forces of evil. So I just want to point out that there is a strong religious strain that underpins a lot of the national security discourse. When they talk about democracy versus authoritarianism or freedom versus despotism, they're really talking about good versus evil or God versus Satan. Now, we see this continuous threat inflation against China. In 1984, the US estimated that China had about 200 warheads, but it would grow to 800 by 1994. Well, that didn't happen in 1999. They estimated, again, China had about 200 warheads, but that it would grow to 460 by 2020. And then it didn't happen. And in 2020, they estimated again, China had about 200 warheads, but that it would grow to 1,000 by 2030 and 1,500 by 2035. And currently they estimate about 400 warheads. The Chinese have said this is groundless speculation. The Chinese do not want nuclear war, and they certainly don't want any kind of war. But there's a mindset of the United States which sees itself as the global police. And like police they see threat where there is no threat. For example, they, shoot people of color because they were holding a spoon, a wallet, a toy. So when China first built nuclear weapons, as soon as they built a nuclear weapon, they proposed a policy of no first use. No first use is a Chinese policy, and they proposed it immediately after they built their weapons. Of course, the United States didn't take them up on it, and instead they continued to escalate. And during that period in the 60s, the Chinese actually expected the United States to obliterate all of their coastal cities and annihilate the industrial base. And they created what was called the Third Front, where they replicated their entire industrial capacity inside hidden inland cities near or inside mountains. That's why you have cities like Chongqing or Panzihua. It's as if the United States were expecting the Chinese to blast New York City, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and San Jose, and then they recreated them in toto inside Wyoming and the Rockies, hidden inside mountains. So the Chinese approach has to have a minimal deterrent. It doesn't have launch on warning. It separates warheads from delivery vehicles. And even when it was facing existential threat, its approach was to see if it could find a way of surviving US nuclear Armageddon. But the key thing is the Chinese do not have a first strike policy, as opposed to the United States. Now, remember in 1980, Jimmy Carter signed the Presidential Directive 59, making counterforce strikes, that is to say, first strike, the cornerstone of US nuclear doctrine. A counterforce strike, to put it very simply, means a nuclear sucker punch. It's you hit your opponent first and you knock out all of their nuclear assets. And by doing so, the theory is that you're going to come out ahead. You're going to win. This is also referred to as NUTS, or nuclear utilization target selection. So the other thing to point out is that the US is planning protracted war. And one of the things that they're planning is to integrate nuclear activities into US conventional exercises. So conventional war and nuclear war are now considered to be a continuum, and that essentially that they should move directly from one form of war to the other. And we know that the US cannot win a conventional war anywhere, certainly not with China. And so what they want to do is integrate nuclear activities into a spectrum of war with China. The US had plans to nuke China in 1956, 1958, 2000, 1962, and 64. They knew that they had no chance of success unless nuclear weapons were used from the outset. These are some of the plans. They plan to destroy 50 cities and 70% of industrial capacity so that China would no longer be a viable society. And of course, we know that the US and Netanyahu would like war with Iran. But all of this is to say is there's no such thing as a little nuclear war. We know that there's tremendous escalation, as Norman has pointed out, with Russia. They're very, very dangerous escalations, that certainly changes in the strategic calculus. And of course, we know that there are people inside the national security state that have theorized the game of the world, the end of the world. They think that they can win it. I'm thinking of Dr. Strangelove There's the doomsday machine inside it. Daniel Ellsberg called this film, he said, this is a documentary. And we know that they've mapped out an escalation ladder. We know that we have gone significantly up this escalation ladder. And we have seen, for example, shows of force, demonstration of force, justifiable counterforce attacks, etc. So once again, U.S. Nuclear Posture Review considers preemptive nuclear use possible, considers retaliatory nuclear strikes justified if they're conventional attacks against strategic platforms. They want seamless integration of tactical nukes into war. And we have to remember the madness of our ruling class cannot be underestimated. We have to remember that we do not get a second chance to stop nuclear war. Prevention is essential. Thank you, everybody.
Wow. Another great presentation, KJ. I mean, your presentations are always filled with remarkable research and facts, and we really, really appreciate it. And the details that you've gone into of just what happened today and the bombing of a small village in South Korea, less than walking distance to the DMZ, is horrifying, just horrifying. And the images of that December 3rd coup that the president of the country attempted on the country, and the bravery of the parliamentarians of climbing the walls. I mean, while we were watching that, I was thinking back to January 6th, and while there's no comparison on who was doing what to whom, but the courageousness of the parliamentarians, and seeing some of those pictures where several of them and their aides had tackled the special forces guys. Holy samoli, that's really something. So I think we all will be watching very carefully what is going to happen with the judgment of the Constitutional Court, and in the next couple of days. It's a very, very disturbing situation, and we thank the activists in South Korea for standing up for their democracy. We certainly do. And of course, we have to stand up for ours too, because there's a lot of things that are happening right now for that. Can you elaborate on the mechanism of China's no first strike policy? What makes it convincing that they will enforce the policy if circumstances get tough?
Well, you know, the Chinese came out with it first. This was not something that was developed in the West. They believe that nuclear war, as others have said, should never be fought and can never be won. And so they put that forth as a proposition. Remember, the Chinese foreign policy has always been something that is very, very conservative. They don't seek to go out and conquer territory. There's a kind of natural boundary that China falls within, and it is really that they saw the need for a nuclear deterrent, because as I showed you with those documents, which are public record now, 1958, 1960, 1961, 1962, 1963, 1964, the US contemplated nuking China and destroying 70% of its cities. And the plan in the PSYOP plan was that if we go to war with Russia, with the USSR, we'll just nuke China along the way, even though they knew that China and Russia had already had the Sino-Soviet split, that they were no longer on speaking terms. So they said, you know, we're having a nuclear war with Russia. Let's knock out China as well. Let's knock out, 70% of their industrial base and make them no longer capable of having, a viable society. That was literally the plan. The Chinese don't want that. They believe that they want, it's a different conception of politics, but even of the family line. They want to keep their family lines, which go back thousands of years. They want them to continue into the future. And I always hear people say, well, that's just words. How can we trust them? The question really is not how can we trust them, because China has never used nuclear weapons. It has never threatened the use of nuclear weapons. And it keeps, according to the US's own estimates, it keeps them on, it doesn't have launch on warning, and it has a minimal deterrent, 200 times the 5,000 or 6,000 that the United States has. So I think that's a reasonable assumption to make, that they don't want nuclear war. They really are keeping it to the absolute minimum. And I think that we have to start with an act of faith in order to make progress, rather than assume that the worst of what we have already done, which is to use nuclear strikes and to have a declarative policy of nuclear first strike, we need to step away from that projection onto the other. Once we stop that projection, then we can start to see things with a clear perspective and start to engage in the really necessary discussions for de-escalation.
Norman, the question is, with last Friday's blow up between Trump and Zelensky, and then things that have happened since then, what is your analysis of how things may be going on the Ukraine-Russian front and any peace talks?
Well, I agree with people who said that Trump was behaving like a mafia thug in a worst way, and yet sometimes the broken clock is correct. And if you set aside the thuggery, the arrogance, the jingoism, the threats, how dare you insult the United States of America, I think Trump was saying, take his name away from it, some very intelligent things. Like, why should I go around insulting Putin when we need to do negotiations? Why don't we do negotiations? I mean, I think this is a rationality that's been lacking from the White House for several years. And I say that as somebody who I say that as someone who believes that Trump is a neo-fascist and that he's a terrible danger to democracy. But that said, what's the solution here? Is it, let's have another hundreds of thousands of Russians and Ukrainians kill each other? What has been the posture in US media and politics that's been so dominant is we really have a high ethical plane. We're on the moral high ground. We want to help the war to continue by sending weapons to Ukraine and watch Ukrainians and Russians kill each other. And that is what passes for wisdom among the US punditocracy and most politicians in Washington. And I think instead what we need to be continuing to demand, hopefully more and more effectively, is we want diplomacy and we want an end to arms shipments because we believe in diplomacy.
And I'll just add a few words to that. We shouldn't think of the Ukraine war as a single war, but as part of a unified field. This is the term that Kurt Campbell used. He said that it is a unified field of war, both Ukraine and the war with China. And originally, the plan was that China was the main dish. The US is escalating to war with China. That is the main dish. And Russia was going to be an appetizer, that they were just going to barrel through, because Russia is simply a gas station with nukes, right? So they didn't think Russia would last. And the question among the NatSec ruling elite was, when we knock out China, is Ukraine and Russia, is Russia going to be the appetizer, or is it going to be the dessert? Do we knock out China first and then finish off Russia and give it a strategic defeat after we have destroyed China? Or do we go through China, do we go through Russia on the way to China. And what was supposed to be a trifle, an appetizer, turned into a 12-course meal of flounder. And essentially, the US is choking. This is the NATO's best and US's best doctrine and best arms has shown that it cannot persist in a war of attrition against Russia. NATO war doctrine has been shown to be faulty, and US industrial and NATO industrial power has shown to be insufficient to bleed Russia out and to give it that strategic defeat that they wanted. And as a result of this, the Trump administration, in my opinion, is trying to cut its losses. It's trying to say, Europe, you deal with Russia by yourself, and if you bleed and if you are undermined, that's fine with us, but we're going to pivot to China. So I think there's a lot of people who see that there is a continuity of doctrine between the Biden administration and the Trump administration in that they both want war with China. And it's simply a matter of priorities. That is to say, these are people who believe that they're simply going to pivot to China, consolidate their forces, and wage war against the main enemy, which is what they've been saying all the time, and then deal with Russia later and let Europe deal with Russia. So I think we have to understand it in those terms.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a discouraging analysis that all these administrations seem to be going after China, and one would hope that somehow we can convince them not to, but boy, it's a tough one. In the UN, I was having discussions with some of the European delegates that were there, and they are aghast at how quickly the military budgets have increased for their countries. And President Trump saying, you're on your own, that has just, accelerated the talk about how much money that they have to have in their budgets. So it's a very discouraging time for it. Before we go on to another question, I just wanted to mention that in the chat, one person had mentioned that March 9th at 6 p.m. in Chicago, the Koreans who were, I think I'd mentioned that the Koreans that suffered during the atomic explosions in 1945 were brought from Korea to Japan to work in the mines and to work in big industries and munitions and things like that. Well, some of the one person who was in his mother's womb at the time of that, he is here in the United States with 3 other victims from Korea of that atomic bombing, and they will be speaking in Chicago on March 9th. And this is one of the booklets that is being put out by the tribunal for Korean victims of the atom bombs. So there's more and more information coming out, and there is a website. Let's see, atomicbomb.org, I believe is it, or Korea Atomic Bomb. I'll find it and put it in the chat there. Let's see. Jerry, let me ask you, have you found some more questions we need to have?
While Jerry's looking up questions, just a quick comment about the hibakusha. Remember, Japan colonized Korea from 1910 to 1945. During that period, they kidnapped and enslaved hundreds of thousands of Koreans, as well as millions of Chinese. They sent them to Manchuria in what was called the Manchurian Passage. People have compared it to the Belgian Congo in terms of the sheer number of people killed and worked to death. But they also sent thousands, tens of thousands, to Japan as slave laborers. And so when the atomic bomb went off, there were about 50,000 Koreans who were essentially slave laborers who were killed or affected by the atomic bomb. When Japan surrendered, it decided that all the Korean slaves that it had brought onto Korean soil had no rights whatsoever. And as a result, the surviving atomic bomb survivors who were Koreans, hibakusha, were not allowed to receive any medical care. And so the level of fatality was extraordinarily high, but we still have some people who survived, and these people are bearing testament, to the sufferings that they received, and also, again, the incredible importance of preventing nuclear war.
Indeed. And I'll just mention some more that was offered to us while we have been here in New York, that there were actually 70,000 Koreans that were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 40,000 were killed by the U.S. atomic bombs. 57% of all the Koreans that were in those two cities were killed. Of the 30,000 that were left, 7,000 stayed in Japan for some reason or another. 23,000 went to the Korean Peninsula. And at that time, it was not a divided peninsula. People went to their homes. And then later on, the division happened. And it turned out that there were 21,000 that ended up in South Korea. And they got some treatment. The South Korean government helped somewhat, not a huge amount. The ones that were in North Korea, there were 2,000 of them. And the only reason I know this is because there is one article that's been written about this. And the reason that they actually got more treatment was that one Korean that was left in Japan knew that there were some people that had been affected by these atomic weapons that were living in North Korea. And he got the Japanese medical team to go to North Korea to try to help the government in anything they could do to help these people. And he also was able to get the Peace Museum in Hiroshima to send some photographs so that the people of North Korea could have more sympathy for these people who had suffered such losses. So it is quite a story there. Let's see, we have one other question right here I can see. When people focus on reducing the number of nuclear missiles by the great powers, I'm unclear whether it makes a difference, whether a country has 1,000 or 500 missiles. A small number would suffice to destroy the perceived enemy. Can you explain the focus on the number of weapons?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The focus on the numbers is largely a diversion from the reality. You can think of it as pruning a tree. You prune a tree maybe to make it healthier. And in point of fact, in a macabre way, they're trying to make the nuclear force healthier by ditching the older missile systems and upgrading as they see it what has more accuracy. I mean, one of my first arrests was we were blockading the white train taking Trident warheads. Well, these were MIRV. These were multiply targeted and more accurate. Now they've been on Tridents for many, many years, into the tens of years. They're more accurate. They're counterforce. They're designed for first strike. And so a lot of times we'll hear, oh, the United States and Russia, they've reduced the number of weapons. Well, great. But that's not really the point. And that gets me back to the question of ICBMs. Dan Ellsberg made a really clear point. He said it didn't matter if there are 400 ICBMs in the silos or 100 in the silos. The fact is that 100 of them is still what they call a nuclear sponge, but it would attract a first strike attack because of the lunatic military idea you strike first to wipe them out. And as I said, it's the only vulnerable part of the triad. So that's why when we hear people in Congress or some lobbyists in Capitol Hill saying, oh, well, let's just reduce the number of ICBMs. Say, yeah, there is a good number to get it to, and that is 0. And I do want to mention William Perry's name flew out of my head a little bit earlier this evening, but he was the defense secretary, and I put that in quotes, defense secretary, who later wrote a piece in the New York Times. And as I speak, I am clicking it here to the chat. And you may want to take a look at it because it's titled "Why It's Safe to Scrap America's ICBMs." That was published in 2016. So 9 years later, the need is still there to get rid of ICBMs.
I would also add not simply ICBMs. I mean, certainly what we need is not simply to scrap them, but along the way, treaties have to be implemented and enforced. And also, we have to be very, very attentive to the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons. As I pointed out with the CNAS documents, standard discourse in Washington right now is that tactical nukes are usable. And what people call tactical nukes are actually scores of times more powerful than what was dropped on Hiroshima. And so I think we have to be very, very mindful of that this is a continuum that has been built into US war doctrine. The other thing that I think is really important that people may or may not be aware of is the role of AI. Artificial intelligence is now becoming integrated into US war doctrine. It's being used for targeting, target acquisition, and to speed up the decision cycle, and also to continue war after human life has been extinguished. And we saw the use of AI in Gaza with the programs Lavender, Hapsora, and Where's Daddy. These were programs that were built by Anduril, and Anduril is right now working with the US military to expand AI into all of its doctrine and weapons, including nuclear weapons.
And I'd briefly add that when we talk about treaties, and thanks for bringing that up, there are all sorts of treaties, nuclear weapons treaties that have been killed by the United States. The second President Bush, the ABM treaty, and here we have President Trump, who a few hours ago said he wants to denuclearize the world, which is a great concept, but he killed one of the most wonderful achievements of the anti-nuclear movement in the history of the nuclear age, which is the INF Treaty. It was because people around the world protested in huge numbers that we got the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, banning a whole category of missiles from Europe. And when he was president several years ago, Trump killed the treaty and for good measure killed the Open Skies Treaty. So, it's one thing to hear the rhetoric, but we've got to demand action.
Thank you. Alice
Just
Slater.
one more thing I want to add. I don't want to catastrophize, but we know that Elon Musk has a plan, quote unquote, to nuke Mars, which is absurd on the face of it. But many, many people are seeing that as simply a way of putting nuclear weapons into space. And if that happens, that's game over. That is such an extraordinary threat to, the world that has to be stopped. If people are saying, is there something we need to stop? We need to stop the abuse of AI in war and the escalation of nuclear weapons into space. Remember, armies always look for the higher ground, and there is no higher ground than space.
And that leads right into the question that Alice Slater, who's one of our great experts on nuclear issues, she says, what about the space ban and cyber bans with Russia and China? How do you get to abolition of the potential for nuclear weapons in space?
Well, I just make a generic comment, which is that nothing good is going to happen until we build movements. And there's never been a history where on nuclear weapons or war, anything good has been an initiative from Capitol Hill or the White House. And so this latest category of weapons, we're only going to stop them and get a sane policy if people organize community by community and raise hell. And that means lighting a fire under every member of the House and Senate. And I would just close on this note. It's often overlooked that every member of the House has local district offices. They provided us with nonviolent targets. And how often have we heard about picket lines or sit-ins at congressional offices? It's very rare, and it's waiting there for us to do it.
It's true, but there are some good folks out there who take the time to go into specific offices and actually have built some relationships with some of the the congressional staffers because they are so consistent and they go in and they don't get arrested every time, but they do take the time to go in and bring materials to the staffers and hope that people are listening, and they listen when you are there more and more and more. We kind of find that out when we're down in Washington, going into the offices, but I will say it's a tough road. There are a lot of mean people that are members of Congress and they're staffers. So you have to kind of get a thick skin to go in, but that's the cards we're dealt with in a way that is our job, to keep going after these people, to explain why nuclear weapons should be abolished, why there should never, ever be the thought of them going into space or anything like that. And that diplomacy and peace, diplomacy, words, talking, speaking with people rather than using bullets are the way to go. I want to thank very, very much. I know we've got a lot of questions and everything left, but we want to thank our guests today, our speakers today. And I know that you all, you both are very active. You're both in a lot of different webinars, and you have so much to say about so many issues. So we in Veterans for Peace will continue to watch where you are speaking and value very much the time and effort you put into preparing yourself so that you can help educate us. So let's give a big round of applause to our speakers. And Jerry, would you like to finish this off for Veterans for Peace, please?
Well, just thank everybody for being here. The Veterans for Peace Nuclear Abolition Working Group meets monthly. We often have guest speakers at our monthly meetings as well. We meet on the fourth Fridays of every month, and we welcome both veteran members and people who are not members of Veterans for Peace. We all have to do what we can to keep on supporting and pushing our government to sign the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and to end the horrible genocide in Gaza, to push for diplomacy, to end the war in Ukraine, and to let all our friends and neighbors know that China is not our enemy and we should not be preparing for war against China. So there's lots of work for all of us to do. Thank you, Ann. Thank you, KJ. Thank you, Norman. Thank you, everybody who's here. We all have our work cut out for us.